The ash tree has been a core part of Britain's forests for thousands of years and is the third most common tree in the UK. However, the 80 million ash trees that live in our woodlands now face a new threat that could see them all wiped out. A fungus known as ash dieback or Cholera frixinea, which attacks and kills ash trees, has come over to Britain from the continent and is rapidly spreading through our forests. If Britain's ash trees fall victim to this new threat, we may see the entire ash tree population disappear.
So we have 80 million ash trees in the UK and a large proportion of those will be susceptible to this fungus.
If we lose all the ash, it will have a devastating effect, there's no doubt about that.
If you've got older infected trees, then the thing to do is just to leave those to die naturally.
In order to find out where the fungus really came from, I travelled to the heart of the source. It was first spotted here in Norfolk in small amounts over 7 months ago. However, now I hope to investigate whether the fungus has wilted and found an environment where it can really thrive. Here in Ashwellthorpe Forest in Norwich is where the first documented case of the cholera was confirmed by the Forestry Commission in a wildwood rather than a nursery back in September 2012. Now, with 7 months later, you can see the spread of the infection is at a real critical level. Dr. Anne Edwards is the researcher who first discovered the ash dieback was present in the Ashwellthorpe Forest. She's been tending to the woodland for over 20 years and now has to witness the fungus attack the ash trees she has spent decades raising.
And it was then quite obvious that whatever was the trouble with the trees had spread quite alarmingly. I took a sample into the lab and just did a simple DNA test, a PCR, and when it came up positive, I thought we got cholera in Ashwellthorpe Wood.
Once Anne reported the presence of the cholera to the government, she was told that the ash tree dieback was not present in any British forests. However, after being presented with the scientific proof, they could no longer ignore the situation.
And the Forestry Commission then did agree that that's what it was, they confirmed it, and then it sort of set this huge ball rolling, and within weeks it said that they'd announced that Cobra meeting in government, you know, there was this national emergency, and that was all sort of snowballing, you know, so then you think, oh, you know, you can't just sit back and do nothing. I mean, that was the thing, oh, well, you know, let's see what happens. No, you know, you've got to try and do something, I think, even if turns out there is nothing that can be done. If we lose all the ash, it will have a devastating effect, there's no doubt about that. I'm still hoping that we do have some level of resistance somewhere in this wood and that we'll be able to, it will naturally recolonise.
Runscombe Farm Reserve has been an important botanic site for hundreds of years. It is home to many different species of plants and trees, including ash trees. Ben Sweeney is the Plant Life Reserve Warden in charge of tending to the woodland. He's been working in the woods for years and is all too familiar with the dangers the cholera poses to not only the ash trees, but the rest of the woodland. He spoke to me about how losing the ash tree would be devastating for the forest.
Yeah, the issue is if the ash goes, what takes its place? You know, beech and oak maybe, but they take a lot longer to actually set seed and establish. What you would hope is that, yes, we might expect through here a lot to be lost, but some might survive, some that had the inbuilt defence, and then might actually then they would, over a very long period of time, hopefully repopulate.
Once the fungus had been confirmed as present in the UK, hundreds of DEFRA officials took samples from ash trees all over the country in order to determine how far the fungus had spread. Once the samples had been taken, they were escorted to laboratories for testing. One of the leading labs in plant pathogens and specialists in the cholera is the laboratory at the John Innes Centre, where they are leading the charge in the defence of the ash tree by taking regular samples of the fungus in order to track its development. I'm here at the Sainsbury's Laboratory in Norwich, where they're leading the fight back against the ash dieback. I've come to see Dr. Diane Saunders, who's one of the lead researchers on the project. Hi, Dan.
Hello.
So, what could you tell me about the actual disease itself? How does it actually attack the trees?
Well, ash dieback is a serious threat to our 80 million ash trees here in the UK. And this is the causal agent, so the fungus that causes this nasty disease on ash trees. And here you can see it growing on an agar plate that we're cultivating it here in the lab at the Sainsbury's Laboratory.
Okay. So when the dieback is attached to the trees, what does it actually do in order to kill the tree?
Well, it starts to weaken the defences of the trees. So we see actually that it destroys the younger saplings, so the young ash trees. But with the older mature trees, they tend to be a little bit more resilient, so it weakens them, so secondary infections can occur, and that's ultimately what kills the trees. So we can do a DNA extraction. So when we identify the trees, the first thing we need to do is we look at the symptoms. We see that they have typical ash dieback symptoms, but we can't be sure that this is ash dieback. We have to do a special process called a DNA extraction, and then we can look at the DNA that we get from the tree and see whether the fungus is in there. So there's some signatures which tell you that this is the fungus that we're looking for. So you'll need to wear some goggles. We take the central pith material, which is usually quite soft. This is a slightly older sample, so it's a little bit more hardened. And then we can collect all this material here. And then we can use this for doing the DNA extractions. And then the DNA extraction itself will then lyse these cells to allow the DNA to be free and move into the solution, so that then we can extract the DNA. So we put this into a mortar and pestle. So then we can use liquid nitrogen, which is extremely cold, in order to break up the material. And we can grind it down into a really fine powder. Okay, so now we have a very fine powder. And then
Okay, so what would be the next step once you've got these?
So the next step then is to use a series of different solutions in order to open up the cells and get the DNA out. We're checking for specific sequences that we know should be present, and that will confirm. It's like a diagnostic test for whether or not the fungus is there.
Here, just north of Dover, this private woodlands ash trees have been ravaged by the dieback, mainly destroying the saplings and the younger trees. However, the impact here is more than just environmental. At this private woodland cultivated mostly for firewood, Bruce Stewart Hill has been hit hard by the disease. His living depends on having healthy trees he can replace once they've been harvested. He spoke to me about how the fungus has hit his trees and how it will impact his future.
Okay, if you look at this is from the bottom end. It's a healthy ash sapling, but it's got the disease in it. So, you know, it just breaks away. If you have a look at something that's healthy, that's the difference. That's a nice green ash sapling. You can see it's got its proper colour. It's alive. It's doing what it needs to do. And then if you have a look at the one that's been impacted by the fungus, it's brown, it's dead, it's no good. I mean, at this age, both of them should be looking like that. So that's all we got to inherit now.
Bruce has been harvesting these trees for almost a decade, and it's painful to see such a large portion of his trees get taken over by the dieback so rapidly. The government maintain that the outbreaks in the southeast of the UK are due to the infection blowing over the channel rather than the possible spread from government nurseries planted throughout Kent.
The ash dieback can't travel more than 20 kilometres. So the Forestry Commission and the government saying, no, it's blown over. And it can't blow over because the closest, Calais is closest to Dover, and that's 30 kilometres. It's a coincidence. They planted the trees a couple of years ago, and I get the ash dieback. And everyone knows. Everyone who's been in the tree planting industry has known about this for, I don't know, 5 years, maybe 7 years. But it's the old thing. It's trade is more important than preservation of a species.
Bruce's livelihood may not be in direct danger, but the long-term effects of the dieback could damage his business once passed on to his successor.
And bearing in mind my business is firewood, it's not an issue from a revenue perspective, so I'm not going to lose any money from that perspective. My son's going to lose revenue, not me, because the ash trees, instead of growing up and ending up with these wonderfully straight poles, and thousands of them, we're going to be ending up with some coppice bulbs that are just spread out and just, not going anywhere, basically.
Once the cholera had been confirmed in the UK, the government called in experts from around the country to consult them on the situation. I travelled to the Midlands to find some answers about what the government's plans for the dieback were. I hope to discover the answers to my questions at Harper Adams University and some more background on how the fight against the fungus is going. I'm also interested in how the government believe the country is vulnerable to other diseases. I've come to the Harper Adams University in Telford today in order to talk to Professor Simon Leather, a leading expert in entomology. Professor Leather is one of the few experts that has been drafted in by the government to consult them on the ash tree dieback situation. I'm hoping to talk to Professor Leather about the steps that have been taken and the steps that are yet to be taken in order to contain the situation. Simon Leather is a professor of entomology here at Harper Adams University and is part of the team assembled by the government to come up with the most viable strategy to combat the cholera and do what they can to save the ash tree in Britain. I came to Telford to discuss both his theories on the spread of the infection and what the next logical steps were in the battle to save one of Britain's most iconic trees.
I mean, there's sort of two theories about how ash dieback has got into the country. One is that there's been a sort of meteorological event which has blown the spores across the channel from northern Europe, and the other one is that it's been transmitted by infected saplings being brought across and put into nurseries and then spread out into the country for plantings and things like that. And actually, when you look at the evidence, there's evidence for both these mechanisms of transport.
After accepting that the fungus was present in the UK through one method or another, the experts assembled by the government turned their attention to the future of the ash trees in Britain.
The current situation, which is, it's here, so there's no point in trying to keep it out anymore, and it's sort of learning how to live with it. It makes an impact if you lose a whole tree species like that. So it's worth managing ash rather than, I mean, there's no way that we can sort of control it, but it is something that we ought to be thinking about. How can we replace it in the landscape, and how can we make the transition from this sort of epidemic status to a managed ecosystem with ash still being present in the system. So, trying to prevent its spread is going to be pretty impossible, and it's more important to say, right, we're going to manage the situation, and the money that we might have used in trying to control it, we can use for making our borders more secure against any future incursion of another pest or disease.
Despite the failures in stopping the spread of the dieback, there is still hope. Back at the lab in Norwich, the scientists, along with Dr. Saunders, have miraculously unlocked the genome of the cholera itself, allowing them to identify exactly which parts of the DNA attack the ash tree, and hopefully this may lead to either a way of curing the disease or at least a more effective resistance against the infection.
So unlocking the genome of the ash dieback fungus is really key in order to understand why this pathogen is such a threat, how it's moved across the UK, where it actually originated from. We can find out all this information from the genome sequence, and we can also start to understand why indeed it's so aggressive, so trying to identify some novel components of the genome. We've identified a key toxin that might be used by this fungus, and that was all possible through the genome sequencing and through the transcriptomic analysis, so sequencing of genes which are turned on during infection.
Unlocking the genome was an important step in the battle against the cholera. However, it is not a quick fix to the situation. Once the scientists discovered what parts of the diseases did what, they needed to bring the fight out of the lab and to the rest of the country.
So now we're trying to take samples from different locations across the UK, and then we can compare them to look at the population dynamics, so to look at how this fungus has spread around the UK, and to see whether you have a similar isolate here in Norfolk to something that you would find elsewhere in the UK. So we have 80 million ash trees in the UK, and a large proportion of those will be susceptible to this fungus. And so the real key of this project is to start to screen ash trees specifically from the UK to see whether we can find ones with low susceptibility or indeed resistance to this fungus. And then we can put those trees into breeding programs in order to repopulate the UK ash tree population.
The dieback has been present in Eastern Europe for over 20 years already, and scientists on the continent have been battling the fungus with little success ever since it ravaged the forests of Eastern Europe towards the end of the last century.
Well, we already have colleagues in Denmark who've identified this low susceptibility tree, and so we're going to actually sequence the genome from that low susceptibility tree, which is called tree 35, and then we can start to look at the UK population of ash trees. As the fungal pathogen develops around the UK, we can start to identify ones which also might show low susceptibility and then compare them to what they've seen over in Europe and see whether they're similar to this tree 35.
Although the fungus is here and there's no changing that, there is hope on the horizon. With the genome unlocked and a potentially resistant tree out there, I doubt we'll be saying goodbye to the ash tree anytime soon.